Hi, Vince.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Vincent Horn. Well known to a lot of people interested in Buddhism and meditation, in part because of your podcast, Buddhist Geeks, which we'll talk about a little, and which originally brought you to my attention. But more broadly, you've been interested in, as the title of the podcast suggests, I guess you've been interested in the way that modern technology intersects with Buddhism, meditation, changes the way meditation is taught, the way people can figure out what meditation is right for them, apps that supposedly help them meditate. We'll talk about all this stuff, and we'll talk about what you're doing along the lines of teaching these days. And so let's start. I mean, you were kind of ahead of the curve, right? On when did you start Buddhist Geeks? 7, 8 years ago, or
10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, the focus was on technology and meditation. That's what Geeks connoted.
Well, that was a big part of it, and the other side of it was kind of the meaning, of geeks, which is more about someone who's passionate about something, kind of a general sense of geek. And so it was kind of the Buddhist geekiness in terms of passion about Buddhism and meditation, but also the technological geeky intersection of modern culture and modern technology with kind of the Buddhist meditative scene.
Okay. And is there kind of a little bit of a natural intersection with Silicon Valley there, although you are not physically in Silicon Valley?
In terms of the circulation of ideas, for sure, there's a strong Silicon Valley headwind rolling through the Buddhist Geeks archive.
And I'm curious about. I have some specific questions about technology and Buddhism, but before I get into those, what are some of the big themes that you've kind of happened upon? I mean, when you think of technology and Buddhism, are there some kind of big picture thoughts about what's happening here?
Well, sure. I mean, there have been a few things that have emerged over the last, it's weird to say that, but last decade of doing the show and talking to a lot of different people. And with technology, some of the big themes have been around, one, how do people who are aspiring to be better contemplatives or meditators or just have better trained minds and attentions, how do we interface with digital technology? How do we use it? How do we utilize it? And then the other part of this, which started to emerge too, was, and if we're making technology or designing technology in any way, how do we incorporate those insights from the meditation world, or in our own experience, hopefully, into the designing and making of the technology, which then further, if you take it further, there's the recognition that science, that technology in a sense is a type of applied science, and that we've had over the last 20 or 30 years a big kind of upswelling of interest in the scientific community for the intersection between Buddhist meditation and science, which has been called contemplative science. And so there's this whole other aspect of Buddhist Geeks exploring what is the application of that in terms of technologies, and that is something I've sort of called contemplative technology, which is just pointing out that there's contemplative science already, so of course that's going to give rise to contemplative technologies. And so those are more not like how do we interface with technology, but technologies we actually utilize to help with some aspect of contemplative development.
Okay. Why don't we start at the, I guess, more mundane end of the spectrum of possible technological uses, and that's just like meditation apps. Now, I just haven't looked into them much, in part because, I have a daily meditation practice, and it's just kind of hard for me to imagine how an app could do me a lot of good. I mean, maybe, because it just seems like, the issue is pretty straightforward. If I make myself meditate every day, things get better, and the more I meditate, the better things get. And, there are times you need a refresher, and you might go to a retreat or something, or seek some kind of guidance from a teacher, conceivably. But it's hard for me to imagine the way an app could valuably be worked into my daily practice, but maybe I'm wrong. I haven't looked. Do you have anything to say on that front?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what I hear you saying is, in a way, that given how you've been practicing and how you were introduced to it and how you do things, an app, especially one that's like introducing meditation to you, is probably not going to make a lot of sense given the way that you practice. I think and I think that's true for a lot of people, myself included. I don't usually pull up apps to meditate or listen to guided meditation tracks. Mm-hmm. That said, there are millions and millions of people who are getting turned on to meditation through the same channels, and for them, because they didn't start meditating in a pre-app, world, that's like their introduction to meditation class, or they're like, I first started meditating with some CDs from Sounds True, and so that's the new CD. Mm-hmm. So for those people, I think it's more of a relevant kind of onboarding into the world of meditation. But for a lot of folks, most of the meditation apps out there are content systems, and then you have some timers, and then you have some kind of crazy things on the frothy edges of contemplative technology. But for the most part, like, they're what you're describing, and they're not that helpful for some people. For others, they're like the portal way.
And did you say content delivery systems?
Yeah, exactly.
So you mean they have the content you're probably familiar with, like a guided meditation or feedback about, guidance about particularly meditation techniques. And then what the app does is, if it's a good app, it does a good job of steering the people who need this particular piece of content to that particular piece of content, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Like some of the biggest meditation apps are things like Headspace and Calm.com and Buddhify. There's a number of them. They're growing, but they're all kind of delivering meditation content to the end user in different ways, mm-hmm. Okay. and with different kind of pricing models and stuff. Okay.
And yeah, it's like Headspace is a subscription model, I gather. I mean, you get a month for free, and if it's working, but you agree these things tend to be most appropriate for people who are just getting introduced to meditation.
Yeah, with some caveats, but yeah, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm. Are there technologies that you have made use of yourself that you might say are more advanced or more sophisticated than apps, or just different? I mean, are you in your own practice? I mean, I know in terms of delivering your teaching, and we'll talk about this, I mean, you obviously make use of the internet and certain features of the internet, but as a practitioner, have you found useful technologies?
Well, I've played with a lot of useful... okay, let me phrase it this way. I've played with a lot of technologies that seem like they might be useful or could be useful, mostly ones that are in early development phases, so EEG headsets being one kind of class.
So they give you feedback? Is that the thing?
Yeah, exactly. You've got things like Interaxon's Muse headset, and Emotive. It's a company in San Francisco that makes a headset called the Insight, and all of them are sort of coming online, and there's applications being developed for them, and they do get some sort of bio-neurofeedback. They utilize some sort of algorithm that tries to make sense of brainwave frequencies that the device is picking up, and then feed something back to you, instruction or visual or auditory feedback.
Like if they sense that your brain is moving toward the state that like they want your brain to move toward, they give you some kind of signal that's taken as reinforcement and means keep doing what you're doing. Yes. You're approaching the sweet spot, kind of.
Yeah, like a practical example is in the Muse app. When you sit with the EEG headset on and meditate, what it's tracking, and if you do well with it, it feeds it back as the sound of birds landing on this beach. Oh. And if you get a bunch of birds, you're really calm, you hear like a ton of birds squawking in the background, which is both, really disruptive, and it's designed to be, but it's supposed to be some sort of indicator that you're on the right track.
Uh-huh. And so have you tried some of these biofeedback things?
Yeah, so I've tried a decent number of them, and that's kind of one category or class of technologies I've seen come up, and I found them really interesting. And again, I could see them being quite useful for beginners, particularly folks that tend to, come from a more skeptical or scientific or technological kind of background, that tend to have a faith in technology that not everyone has. And so the thought, this technology can help me learn how to meditate, that's probably going to be easier if I just learned it by myself.
Right.
And so I see a lot of that, and I see a lot of potential in the future for people that are more intermediate or advanced practitioners to be able to utilize these things too. But I haven't yet seen it in practice done.
What about things like virtual reality? Is anything being done there?
Yeah, that to me is more interesting than the EEG stuff. And of course, it'll be real interesting when they start to converge themselves.
We should, by the way, before we leave EEGs, we should mention that I think what is technically distinct from EEGs, maybe I'm wrong, is the kind of brain scan stuff that like Judson Brewer does, where that would be a version of biofeedback, but that would be different from the EEGs, right? And I know he was working on that. He did these studies, and I first became aware of him by hearing him on Buddhist Geeks, your podcast. And I later had him come talk to a class of mine, and had him on this site actually. But
Nice.
he did a study at Yale Medical School. One of the big studies showing that when adept meditators meditate, what's called the default mode network in the brain, which is kind of the mind-wandering part of the brain, gets very quiet. And that, I think that's technically, so that would be MRI, I guess, as a form of feedback. And I know he was fiddling around with using that as a practical form of feedback, but I don't know what happened to that.
Yeah, so, right. I think you're right as far as I understand. So he was using, I think, fMRI for the study, and then at one point, and I don't know where this went, but at one point when I talked to him, he said that he was trying to take the work he'd done with the fMRI and translate that into an EEG, some sort of translation process.
So it would have been an EEG still.
He was trying to create an EEG application of what essentially the fMRI was measuring, which, so they're measuring different things, so I don't know the technical process there, but I know that that's the leap he was trying to make.
Okay. So anyway, I interrupted you. You were going to talk about virtual reality.
Oh, yeah, so virtual reality. So, yeah, this is exciting, and I'm looking around my office right now. It's being cleaned up, but I have about 3 or so VR headsets here. I picked up the Oculus Rift, the second version of the developers kit, which is just for people who are kind of creating programs for it. I think something like 100,000 of those or more were sold. So a lot of people, building for that platform. And then now Samsung has their sort of headset thing, the Gear VR, and you've got all kinds of Google Cardboard, which you just slap your phone into this sort of makeshift headset.
HTC has a good one, I think.
HTC, PlayStation, everyone's getting into the space, and it's kind of this year's, I guess, most pundits are in the technology world saying this is like the year of VR that's really going to take off. Okay, well, whether or not it does, I'm not sure, but I do see a number of interesting applications that the early people have developed. Some of them kind of fit in that same mold that we were just talking about of, using virtual reality as a computing platform to deliver content, mostly meditation. And that's interesting because it adds the visual component in a much more immersive way than your phone does. And so there's some interesting things happening there, and several people creating applications that do that. The one that I'm familiar with is called Guided Meditation VR, and we've done a little work with that team.
So if I use that particular app and I put the headset on, what do I see that helps me meditate?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So in this case, you put the headset on, you open the app, and you basically get to choose a number of parameters. One is you get to choose your visual landscape, and so they kind of have these several kind of virtual landscapes that are all nature-based in some way. Like you're on a beach or you're at like a Zen monastery, outside Japan, and you pick one of these settings, and then you pick whether you want music or not, and if you want music, you have it playing kind of low in the background. And then you select your style of meditation and different tracks within that. And so essentially it plays the track over top of the immersive visual auditory environment that you sort of selected from the parameters they give you. And so the idea and the concept is, in a sense, that it's kind of a trick in a way that, by inviting people into virtual nature environments, they might actually start to feel the sense of relaxation or kind of openness that you actually feel, when you're out in nature. And it's, in a way, it's sort of a, as one of the people I interviewed about this, guy named Michael Heim said, he's a virtual reality philosopher. He said, there's this principle in his area of practice in Qigong, which is that if you push something to its furthest extremes, it'll flip into its opposite. And so he sort of hypothesized that maybe with virtual reality, we'll develop a really beautiful Japanese tea ceremony, for instance, and go in this beautiful environment and do all this intricate stuff. And that will be so moving to us, being in this Japanese setting, in this beautiful nature, that it'll actually compel us to really start to explore the natural world around us in a different way. And so the creator of this app has a similar philosophy, I think. And I don't know whether or not that's going to be true. But a lot of people don't spend much time out in nature, so who knows the impact.
It seems ironic in a way that you would set up the perfect environment for meditation, because part of Buddhist philosophy, one thing meditation is in theory supposed to be is something that allows you to cope with whatever environment you're in, right? And that's kind of part of Buddhist philosophy is, there's a certain amount of kind of stoicism in Buddhist philosophy, the idea that, whether you find a given situation annoying is a matter of interpretation and in a certain sense, mental discipline. So, I'm not objecting. I think it's fine that you use, because the fact is, look, let's face it, retreat centers, they don't generally locate them next to auto repair shops, right? They're in nice places, and part of the idea is you go there and the environment makes you feel relaxed. I'm not objecting. It's just a little bit of a mild irony.
Yeah, no, I totally hear that. And I think what you're describing, that type of meditation or that type of awareness where you can just deal with whatever is going on, it's kind of more of the mindfulness style, or the, from the Buddhist perspective, kind of the Vipassana style, but with more of a kind of concentration-based meditation. You actually are trying to minimize, distractions and create a situation that lets you really absorb your attention into your object of focus.
Right.
And so that's actually more of where I see the VR stuff being interesting, is kind of, and more along the lines of what like a psychedelic drug might do, more so, of manipulating your visual auditory environment in such a way that that actually propels you into an altered state of consciousness, which is what concentration meditation is about. So that's kind of where I see VR being more interesting personally, and I'm with you that mindfulness practice, it may not make a lot of sense, maybe it does.
I can see it helping, but you're right. That's the most common distinction among types of meditation between concentration and mindfulness, I guess. Now, in a couple of minutes, I want to get into your kind of modular approach to meditation, where both mindfulness and concentration figure, but you also have some other types of meditation you talk about. So we'll definitely be getting into that. But first, is there anything else on the VR front that so it tends to be a way of taking you into an environment that's conducive to relaxation and focus?
Or just really trippy environments that kind of alter your sense of perception, at least visually and auditorily. Yeah.
And there are types of meditation where visualization plays a very big role. Tibetan meditation in particular.
Absolutely, and I hear a lot of people talking about that, and I've yet to see anyone build something for it. But that's something I'm pretty interested in.
Yeah. I just taped one of these with a guy named Doug Ostow. I don't know if you know that name. He wrote a book on for Columbia University Press on psychedelics and Buddhism. And there was a study he mentioned that had been done before his own research, but one thing the guy found is that of the basic kinds of meditators, it was people in the Tibetan tradition who had the highest incidence of reporting having used psychedelics or even using them in an ongoing way as part of the practice. And that's tends to involve a lot of visualization. So I guess I can imagine a big VR component there.
Absolutely.
Now, are there any other technologies? I mean, we've mentioned, apps, biofeedback, virtual reality. Leaving aside for now just the ways teachers use them to use the internet to get in touch with students. I do want to talk about that. But are there any other major technologies I've overlooked here?
I think there's another category. It's not as well. There's a couple. One is the sort of the Internet of Things and all the different sensors that we're wearing that are connected. And that's I think a part of this emerging technological infrastructure that's arising right now. And so it's still kind of in the infrastructure early development phase. So there's not a lot of good examples of this. But, one simple example is Apple's new meditation app, Breathe, which uses some of the sensors in their Apple Watch to help give some biofeedback in terms of your breath.
Does it tell you need to meditate right now, or does it?
I don't know. I haven't actually used it. I've just read about it, so I'm not sure how that works.
But that sounds like so it's a form of biofeedback during meditation. They make use of the watches, the monitoring of like pulse and stuff.
That's my understanding. It uses some very simple. Some very simple biofeedback, maybe just pulse. You'll have to double check my recollection of this. But, I mean, the more interesting thing, I think, is that we're all wearing sensors a lot of the time in our phones, oftentimes in wearable devices, if we have a Fitbit or a smartwatch of some sort. And they're going to be embedded in more and more things in our environment as well. And those things can actually, if we're able to tap into those data streams, that are giving, feedback about different biosignatures or environmental situations, they can be utilized in meditative programs, either directly about meditation or just, programs that are trying to maintain an awareness of how your biological and thus your subjective state is, and are trying to kind of consciously work with that, or consciously manipulate it.
Right. Okay, so as a teacher, how have you been using the internet? It obviously makes possible a number of things other than being in the same room with a student as a means of communicating with a student. What have you? I assume by now you've tried a number of different things.
I mean, I think we've tried most of the big stuff, that's come through in the last 10 years. I mean, obviously podcasting, that was kind of the way in for us.
You were early in that game.
Yeah, it was. I think it had been around for a year or two with Apple's kind of entrance, but it was still early, and that's been of course, interesting. And it's been funny too to watch podcasting because it had a big boom and then it kind of disappeared for a while, and it's been booming again. So it's kind of gone through another cycle of entrance, of people being interested in it.
Yeah. Although I find now, I think what got the attention the second time around is largely highly produced podcasts. I mean, not like what we're doing, not just a conversation, but like Serial and just the distribution of a lot of NPR shows via podcast and so on. And now both are pretty robust, I think, both conversational podcasts and highly produced ones. But
and the highly produced ones are presumably bringing more people into the kind of the podcasting world that wouldn't have been otherwise.
Yeah, which is good.
Good for us.
Yeah. And now, were you a teacher from the beginning? When you started the Buddhist Geeks podcast, you also had a teaching practice, or did you not yet?
No. Actually, I was a committed practitioner, and part of my reason for wanting to do Buddhist Geeks was to learn, to like get access to talking to people that I normally wouldn't. Mm-hmm. That was a total selfish reason, and I sort of in the course of doing Buddhist Geeks, I was also going on a lot of retreats and kind of talking to a lot of different people and trying to deepen my own kind of understanding of what all this stuff is about. Mm-hmm. And kind of naturally through that started to teach.
Okay. And when you started, did you start online right away teaching? Because that was available at that point? I mean, you didn't have to transition from something more old-fashioned?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people I talked to, like in a more formal teaching relationship, were folks that I'd met online and folks that I stayed in touch with via Skype.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty much it.
And that's turning out to be viable, I take it. You have a new. I don't know how new it is, but Meditate.io. You are the CEO of Meditate.io and the, I guess, co-founder. Is that right?
Along with my wife, who's also a teaching partner.
And what's distinctive about that?
Well, for us, one of the distinctive elements, or one of the reasons we started it, was to actually distance ourselves from the Buddhist world in terms of teaching meditation. Not totally distance ourselves, but have a place in which we could try other things mm-hmm. that the Buddhist world wasn't so hospitable to try.
Involving technology, or also involving other things?
Involving technology and involving innovation in terms of teaching methodologies, mm-hmm. And in terms of different orientations to, like, what is the purpose of all of this? Mm-hmm. A philosophical break as well, in some ways. You
mean you're allowing... Well, you tell me what you mean. I mean, traditionally, there have been purposes associated with this, things like, well, ranging from enlightenment to, at the more mundane end, there was already this kind of therapeutic use of meditation, mindfulness-based stress reduction and so on. So there's kind of a spectrum of purposes that you might say range from therapeutic to spiritual. What would you say was kind of missing there?
Well, and you mentioned MBSR, which was one of the first programs to really explicitly break from the Buddhist tradition mm-hmm. and start in some way to establish the mindfulness tradition, historically. And that's been really interesting because, the way that I think about it is that mindfulness as a idea and practice was sort of unbundled from the Buddhist institution with that. And it was offered at a scale and at kind of a price that was unmatchable by that previous institution, which is what unbundling does in business.
Right.
The MOOC comes along and unbundles, a certain kind of curriculum in university. I'm sure you're very familiar with this. I've seen you teach a couple of MOOCs, so you're part of this unbundling, I think.
Yeah. The idea is, that things that formerly had to be aggregated into institutions for practical reasons.
Yes.
Like you had to go to a whole university to get a college level course. Now, for technological reasons, you can unbundle and just take a parcel of and so you see mindfulness-based stress reduction as being part of the unbundling of Buddhism, then
of mindfulness from Buddhism.
Yeah,
and what's interesting to that about that for me is that as I practiced in different Buddhist traditions, which are basically bundles of stories and practices and rituals, what I sort of saw was that there were these common practices that were across each of the traditions, but they were done slightly differently from each other. They had different purposes that were sometimes slight and sometimes very clearly different, mm-hmm. and they also were emphasized or de-emphasized to different degrees of intensity. So, like, for instance, the tradition we both know well, the insight meditation tradition, which comes out of Southeast Asian Buddhism, that tradition sort of emphasizes primarily concentration mindfulness, mindful investigation, and the sort of heartfulness practice, that's what I call it, but it's called metta nutrition.
Yeah.
Right. Now there also are practices in Southeast Asia where people worked with questions, for instance, in a similar way that in, say, the Japanese tradition they worked with what are called koans.
Right.
And there also were practices that were about just not doing anything, just resting in a kind of complete, unbroken awareness, especially in the Thai forest tradition. But those weren't really emphasized as much.
Right.
Whereas, like in the Zen tradition, that was like the central things they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, and for Emily as well, we started to notice, there are these core components, these core practices, and they're presented differently. They have different meanings and purposes within these bundles. But what would happen if we unbundled what we see are the core and sort of offered them in a kind of more modular way, where you could say, do you want to try any one of these styles and see what they're about?
Right. And that's currently a big focus of yours, right? This modular thing. We'll link to this piece you wrote on Medium called "Making Meditation Modular," so people can read that. But you basically divide meditation into 5 kind of basic types. Yeah. And you've mentioned maybe all of them, I guess, by now. Concentration, mindfulness, heartfulness, which is commonly known as metta or loving kindness meditation. Inquiry, which I guess you mean like asking the questions explicitly.
Yeah, using questions as a prompt for some sort of discovery. And
then awareness, which I take it you're associating with kind of the Zen type tradition, just kind of being and nothing else. Why don't we go through these and maybe do a little tutorial. The most common distinction is, as you said, between concentration and mindfulness. And in fact, those 2 words are on the 8-fold path that the Buddha lays out. Those are 2 actual words. The final two, not steps, but the final 2 factors in the path are concentration and mindfulness. And both go way back. I mean, there is, on the one hand, you're right that mindfulness, is this, it's to some extent modern mindfulness is a modern creation in some sense, but there is, going way back, the Satipatthana Sutta, the commonly called the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness, very ancient text. So and the meditation described in there has something in common with modern mindfulness meditation and so on. So going way back, you get concentration and mindfulness, and I gather it's concentration. When people think of meditation as a way to reach states of ecstasy and bliss.
Yes.
Certainly ecstasy and have visions and so on. They're thinking of concentration meditation, right? That's the most common path to that kind of thing.
I think typically that's true.
And that's one of the things you teach?
Yeah, so that's one of the core styles of practice that we had trained in different ways and did it in enough different ways to recognize, this is pretty central and this is pretty core, and this is kind of how it works, and we can change how we teach it and how we talk about it a bit, but while still maintaining the sort of the core function of it.
Mm-hmm. And then of these, most people are certainly familiar with the word mindfulness. Some people may have a clear idea of what it means. They probably maybe heard of what you call heartfulness, loving kindness meditation, which is a way of cultivating, kind of empathy toward and compassion for people, even ultimately including people that you're not normally inclined to like very much, including even your rivals and enemies, as part of the standard practice. That's kind of the culmination of it. You start out showing love toward maybe yourself or your friends, your relatives, which is relatively easy, and you move on towards all the way out to enemies. The 2 that people probably are least familiar with are the inquiry and what you're calling awareness. So how does the inquiry thing work? What's an example of this involves explicitly asking yourself a question and meditating on the question?
Well, okay, so taking a step back, when we practice meditation and we teach to folks this is how you do this, we typically make a distinction between a few things. One is whether or not it's a solo meditation or it's a social meditation. So most of the time meditation is taught as a solo practice. You're given instructions do this with your attention, do this with your body, and then you go and you try and do it. That's one way to practice. But another way to practice, and that's increasingly becoming popular, is that we actually do the meditation together. And someone you had on your show, who's a teacher of mine, a friend of mine, Kenneth Folk, took a form of mindfulness practice that had been being done for since the 1950s at least, and said, hey, wait, we could actually, instead of just doing this in our mind, by ourselves, we could do this together. And he made it social. And so that's a social form of mindfulness. So that's one of the things we're trying to figure out, is how to do some of these practices socially. In the case of inquiry, social inquiry also has been being done for a while, but it was mostly done in the human potential movement as kind of like crazy workshops where you sit for like 12 hours and ask someone, who are you? Who are you? Enlightenment intensives, they're called. But we've been playing with, all different ways of asking questions. Like if you and I were practicing social inquiry, I could ask you a question, who are you? And you could respond, and you could ask me a question, I could respond. Or we could just go back and forth asking the question.
Yeah.
There's different ways to practice, but the core of inquiry is about using a question as a prompt for discovery.
Yeah.
And it's a certain kind of question. It's not a rational analytical question that you can get us a very specific measurable answer to. It's a question that's related to consciousness or to some aspect of experience that you could get an answer to, but you might also then 6 months later get a new answer that makes the old answer defunct. So
I have some bad news for you, which is that if you said, who are you to me, I would just say Bob, and I don't think it would carry me to great depths of insight.
I have to ask you again and again.
Yeah, and I keep saying, I'd say, well, technically, Robert. But another kind of question I've heard is that you ask yourself is who hears, or who is hearing, who is seeing, and that points you to this this kind of Buddhist question of whether there's really a self in there. What is there a thing that's doing awareness, or is there just awareness, and that kind of question.
There's so many good, and there's so many classic inquiry questions. Who am I? What am I? Where am I?
Yeah.
Who knows? What is aware of this experience?
Right.
All sorts of things. That have been used classically to kind of drive people into a state of really deep curiosity and also deep sense of not being sure, of cracking away at that tendency towards certainty. That we all
and that's the idea behind the koan as well, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? Giving people imponderables that kind of, in a certain sense, disorient them intellectually.
Yeah, or require more than the rational mind to really fully answer.
Mm-hmm. I've never done any of that or kind of understood how it might work with me, but who knows? Could. So then, awareness. Now, awareness is an interesting word because one could use that to describe mindfulness, right? In other words, mindfulness consists of being more specifically aware of things in your field of awareness than you might ordinarily be. Really focusing on them, paying attention to them, looking at their properties. So you don't mean that by it because you've already got mindfulness as one of the 5 types of meditation. So elaborate a little on what you mean by awareness.
Yeah, so how we're using that term, it's very much akin to how certain schools in Tibetan Buddhism use the term, in particular what's called the Dzogchen tradition. Mm-hmm. And there they talk about the primordial nature of conscious awareness as something that can be noticed or recognized. And so we use it in a way, if you contrast it with mindfulness, we're sort of talking about the difference, as in modern physics, of the difference between particle physics and kind of the wave physics, of looking at discrete individual objects and then the field in which all of those objects are occurring. And so the awareness as the field is the sort of recognition in varying degrees that all of this is one thing, all of this is just happening by itself, and it's all there's nothing that we're experiencing that's outside of our experience. And so when we kind of get that at a, not just a conceptual level, but sort of walking around recognizing there is nothing outside.
And is this associated with the Buddhist idea of emptiness, the philosophical concept?
It's interrelated to that concept.
Well, interrelationship is what the concept of emptiness is about, so that makes perfect sense. I guess maybe we'll leave it at that. But okay, so that's kind of Zen-esque, it sounds like, and other things-esque. But it sounds like
it's also.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's also, and I think the important thing about all these different styles is that they're also modes of consciousness, modes of experiencing your own subjectivity. Mm-hmm. And so when people, for instance, go into Zen and all they do is just sit, like they're given the instruction, just get into posture and sit. They're not told what to pay attention to or how.
Right.
And so part of what the reason for that is that they're, in a sense, being instructed to just be with their experience, and ultimately not to be with it, but just to be it.
Right.
And we're all the sense of like inside and outside, subject and object, feeling of in here and out there, kind of starts to first blur and then eventually collapse. And that collapsing is, you could call that awareness.
Right.
You call that a non-dualistic awareness, with no inside, no outside. And that's kind of what they're kind of pushing for, at least in my own, reading and practice of Zen.
Yeah. So I mean, one way to ask the question maybe is, when you do straightforward mindfulness meditation and you're focusing on individual things. Okay, there's a sound. There's a feeling inside me.
Yes.
Now this can lead you to a state of kind of calm and equanimity, such that it becomes easier to almost take the whole field in.
Yes, that's right.
And even to the point where occasionally I've had the experience that it wasn't clear to me what the difference was between the inside of me and the outside, so to speak.
Yes.
Between like hearing a bird and feeling something, and the bird song seemed no less a part of me than the tingling of my foot, or the tingling of my foot seemed no more a part of me. However you want to look at it.
Yes.
So mindfulness can move you toward that, but it sounds like this is a pretty complete realization of that, and if that's your goal, you're taking a slightly different path toward it than I just described. In other words, you don't start out with discrete focus.
That's right, and this is why I sort of see them as two different styles of practice, because on the one hand, like you say, they can converge and do converge at the higher points of each, you could say. Mm-hmm. But they, like you're describing, they go at it from a very different angle. One of them, mindfulness goes at it from the perspective of breaking experience down into the composite components, the objects that make everything up, the atoms of our experience, and really start to notice how those atoms work, how they flux, how they change, like what is actually at the very basement of our sensory experience. What's the core? What's the cork of our experience? And by seeing that, we start to break hold of the tendency to believe that the aggregates of our sense perception are real objects, including the sense of self, or the sense of someone being other, or the sense of being inside or outside. There's a lot of concepts and a lot of ways we experience the world that are not actually present in the sensory field, so to speak. They're sort of imputed from the top down from memory. And so you can break those patterns and see, like, oh, no, actually this just made it these little vibrating, tingling sensations. Not necessarily.
It doesn't have the meaning. It doesn't have the meaning. It doesn't inherently have the meaning I normally assign it. You mean, kind of?
Yeah, exactly. So you start to see that the meaning is empty there, and so that's a powerful way of kind of. It's like using the mind like a telescope to really zoom into the particular way that experience functions. But awareness asks a different question, which is, what is this thing, which is knowing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is being aware of all this, or what is capable of knowing all these changing objects?
Mm-hmm.
Because the schools of thought that tend to focus on mindfulness tend to see consciousness as itself being something which is changing and discrete, and the schools that focus on awareness tend to see consciousness as something which is primordial.
It's the one constant, kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, well, is the idea that there is such a thing as pure awareness. It's just that normally we don't feel it because normally our awareness is distorted by the business of like operating a self and following our intuitions and so on. But there is this thing that we can return to. That's like a witness consciousness or pure awareness or whatever. Well, witness consciousness may be kind of a technical term that you may or may not want to invoke here, but that's so okay. So there are philosophical stakes here in a way.
There's a different way of conceiving what reality is in each. They have different metaphysics, and so with awareness, you're not trying to kind of gradually refine your powers of observation. Mm-hmm. You're actually trying to let go of the notion that you can get somewhere else in your experience, so that by having some sort of experience, it's going to fundamentally change the nature of your consciousness. And it's kind of saying, no, like that's not how it is. Recognize that already in your current state, whatever it is, things are what they are. You know, there's no need to kind of assume that things are going to be more complete in some future instant, you know, and that the idea of a future instant is itself, you know, arising and passing in this field of awareness.
Right. I mean, in a way, that's back to real basics of Buddhism. It's almost back to the Four Noble Truths. I mean, quit wanting something other than what you have, in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting you mentioned that about consciousness and Vipassana, because I have my experience is kind of in the Vipassana tradition, which is very closely associated with mindfulness. And I have heard, you know, these really advanced meditators say you get to the point where you can see your consciousness blinking on and off or something. Yeah. And I always go like, wait a second, what is seeing the consciousness blink on and off? I mean, how do you know when your consciousness blink on and off? Now, I finally got an answer, which is that, well, you notice, and of course this is very fine-grained perception, obviously, microseconds or something. They say that you notice that reality has changed in between these discrete episodes of awareness. That's how you know that consciousness must have blinked off for a second, because things in the world have changed since you were less conscious. So anyway, is that a little bit related to what you're saying or not?
I think it's related, yeah, and I imagine the person who said that was probably Daniel Ingram, if I had to guess.
Actually, you know, Joseph Goldstein also said that.
Oh, great! That makes a lot of sense.
But yeah, that's. Here's a little a tangential question. Have you noticed mindfulness kind of seeping into various other forms of practice? I mean, one thing I've heard a couple of times is like I was talking to somebody just the other day, and they said, yeah, I'm doing some meditation, and my teacher's from the Zen tradition. And I said, well, what are the instructions they give you? And she said, well, they say, pay attention to your breath. And, you know, and she went on, and it sounded kind of like mindfulness instructions. And I'm wondering if you've noticed that just, perhaps because mindfulness, the opening mindfulness instructions are so easy to latch on to. You know, it's kind of easier than saying, sit there and just be, right? Yeah. It's easier to follow the instruction to focus on your breath than to just be.
It is.
Am I imagining it, or is mindfulness kind of not only seeping into very secular contexts, and but into are kind of all meditation, or many meditation teachers from different traditions starting to use elements of mindfulness?
I think it's all seeping into everything. I mean, there's no real closed walls between these ideas. So yeah, for sure, I've seen both sides seeping into each other.
So, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so with back to your modular thing, these 5 modules you're teaching. So all of these 5 modules, you know, they have a history in Buddhism. You know, it's not like any of them was invented wholesale. So is one of the kind of novel things you're doing just the sheer eclecticism of offering all five? In other words, usually teachers are in one tradition or another, or they may emphasize a couple of these or something. But I guess part of the idea is that you are, well, maybe it's the diagnostic phase when you try to figure out what is the most appropriate entry for a given aspiring meditator.
Yeah, so, I mean, the eclecticism is, it's, in a sense, it's quite old. Many traditions, like I said, they have all of these things, and they even emphasize all of them and more. So it's not so much that part's new. I think what we're aiming for, or trying to do, is to, in a way, also unbundle these different forms of meditation from the original idea of what ethics and awakening or enlightenment were in these traditions, which is that they were a whole package that came together. You had to train in meditation, but you also had to train in your morality or ethics, and you had to train in wisdom or awakening. And so they're all seen as being totally intertwined. And the way that they're intertwined, I think this is the problem, is that in classical Buddhist philosophy, one practices with a particular view of what we're aiming for, and that correct view is what guides our practice. And we're told what the correct view is. In the case of early Buddhism, the correct view says, if you pay attention mindfully to experience, you're going to see it's impermanent, it's changing. It's, when you hold on, you suffer, and, that there's no constant sense of self that you can find in any of that changing phenomena. And so it says, look for that. And then it also has a very clear notion of what morality means. And it sort of spells that out in very clear terms, in terms of precepts of how to act. And it says, this is an awakened person looks like this. They meditate in this way, they experience these things, and they have these kinds of insights which change them in these ways, change how they act and how they are, and who they consider themselves to be. And so that's all interesting, except insofar as that's a philosophy and a theory that's constructed at a particular period of time in response to certain kinds of conditions. And as soon as the conditions change, the cultures change, the time changes, the technological epoch changes, some of those things become totally questionable and maybe even harmful in a new context. And so what I was sort of aiming to do is not just try to update or revise them based on what I think the right moral, ethical approach is, and framework people should adopt, and what I think awakening is, which I have tons of opinions on. Instead saying well, what is your reason for wanting to meditate? Because not everyone wants to meditate to become awakened, or to, become a perfectly moral being or something like that. People also want to meditate to just feel a little bit of sense of relief from struggle, or they want to meditate to get better at something, to get better at a sport, golf, for instance. I was with a couple college students recently drinking tea, and they were each talking about their practice, and a couple of them were classic Buddhists to me. They were interested in awakening and these stages and insights. And then one of the girls, she said, I don't know if this is really relevant, but do you have anything to share about how I could take this meditation and improve my golf game? Because I'm a collegiate golfer. This is a serious part of my life. And it's of course, meditation.
Definitely, I would say no sport is more conducive to improvement through meditation than golf, actually. But that's another subject. So you did this at work. You shaved 3 strokes off of her.
I have no idea, but I do recognize there's a kind of fixed idea that I've shared in for a long time in any of these different lineages or traditions, where in a sense you get kind of brainwashed into thinking that the way that the tradition frames things is actually the only possible way one could experience things, or where one could go with this stuff, and it's just not.
Yeah.
It's just not.
And it's certainly true that the whole, the moral context has changed since ancient Buddhism, and specific precepts may not make any sense. At the same time, I tend to resist when people say, well, look, enlightenment doesn't have to involve any moral dimension at all. I tend to resist that because I just kind of think, what's the point? I mean, it's like, then it's just therapeutic in a certain sense if there's no moral dimension. Now, you might say it's not just therapeutic because it involves seeing reality clearly, and many therapies don't involve that. They just make you feel better. So, I guess technically it's enlightenment if you're seeing the world more clearly. But there's something in me that resists the idea that it should be, in some sense, all about feeling better. And also, I have the belief that if you follow the path toward kind of a clearer view of things through meditation, although it isn't guaranteed that you'll become a better person, it tends to be the case that the things that are making you happier tend to have the effect of making you a better person, because they tend to involve letting go to some extent of the kind of various kinds of selfish warpings of your perception and your behaviors, right? How does all that sound to you?
Yeah, I think in general, I've noticed the same thing, and that's not my ethical foundation for why I do it this way. But because I also recognize that one can use meditative practices to strengthen anything. Can strengthen their concentration in the case of, this is the classic example. This is the mindful sniper. But the mindful sniper exists and is nested in systems of governance and cultural systems and complex, stuff that most everyone is struggling to understand, and has to still do their job and take care of themselves. And meditation could support that in some ethical, local way, but it also could. You could make the argument that from another point of view, meditation can be used, like the Goldman Sachs executive or the sniper, to support systems of oppression or systems that actively take value from folks.
It can be, and it can be a tool that helps people exploit other people more effectively. I mean, I like to think that a fairly likely outcome of serious meditation, and one that I would personally encourage, is to at least kind of extract yourself from the kind of tribal and nationalistic perspective that keeps you from asking why your tax dollars are going to people who are killing these people who happen to be in a different tribe or nation. Now, that's obviously kind of an ideological disposition, but at the same time, in my experience, questions like that are often an outcome of meditation that doesn't necessarily have any particular ideological coloration. In other words, maybe I'm naive. I tend to think that meditation kind of generically tends to give you a just a less self-centered perspective on things and be more inclined to look at things from other people's point of view. It's not guaranteed to do that, but I like to think that it's a technology that tends to have that effect.
I think in general that's probably true, and I think the other part of why this makes sense to me and why I would want to practice this way is, and I'm not saying this is true for everyone. Like, not everyone's going to want a modular approach to meditation. Like, a lot of people are going to want still to say, okay, this is the trusted tradition. This is how it's been done. Whether or not that's actually true it's usually not true. That's the way it's been done for thousands of years. But, there's a sense of authority, and there even could be a sense of authority with the teacher where you feel a sense of confidence and trust that this is going to be good. Mm-hmm. And then you run the program in your own consciousness, so to speak. You run the code and see what happens, but you sort of trust that. For me, I'm sort of thinking, most people I know are too skeptical of those kind of environments to really get into them. Hmm. And also, they might be a little tired of the hippie eclecticism, which is basically, in some ways, in my experience, in the attempt to make everything tolerable and interesting, we're kind of mash a lot of things together without a lot of discrimination and discernment. And then it's like, oh yeah, this is all one, man. It's like, no, it's not actually all the same.
Yeah. Well, I sensed some of this in a podcast, a Buddhist Geeks podcast you did with a guy who, it was a 2-part podcast, I forget his name, but he had this whole thing about the ethics of Buddhism and how this kind of fake modern liberal ethics had been imposed on Buddhism as part of the American teaching of Buddhism. You probably remember who I'm thinking of. It's a fairly recent on the Buddhist Geeks. Yeah,
David Chapman.
And I kind of, I think that's accurate. I mean, I think a lot of kind of even the emphasis on loving kindness meditation, that is an authentic strand, I think. But I think if you just read the Buddhist texts, at random, you wouldn't very often encounter that as a meditative technique. And as a matter of fact, it's not one that particularly works for me. But that's a whole other question. So I think you're definitely right, and about I mean, these spiritual traditions always evolve and get remade, and we can take them in any number of directions, and you're unbundling them. Do you see yourself as in some sense in tension with the American Buddhism establishment? Now, I know your wife and partner has taught at what you might call establishment retreat centers, right? Like Insight Meditation Society, Spirit Rock.
Yeah. But a lot of our teachers are in those establishments, and we.
Okay, so it couldn't be an out and out war you feel with the establishment, but do you feel a little? Do you feel like a little bit of a rebel?
I think it's a generational. It's a generational response. I mean, sometimes it's rebellion, and sometimes it's just like, oh no, this is what we need to keep alive the things that seem most relevant and most useful to people, that we also learned from these traditions, even though there are lots of aspects of the tradition we don't want to replicate or we don't want to assume is appropriate. It's still, in some sense, to want to challenge the traditions feels traditional, because that's what traditions are. That's how they stay alive, is they are constantly regenerating themselves and questioning themselves. Yeah. So I feel traditional, and I feel like a traditional rebel or something.
No, it's always things best as it ever been, without a doubt. Okay, so final question is, now we've had on this show a couple of people I think are kind of on your wavelength in this regard, in terms of where they see themselves with respect to the Buddhism establishment, and that includes Daniel Ingram, Kenneth Folk, and there's a Wired magazine piece, which I mentioned when I talked to Kenneth Folk, and it describes a scene where you are at a table with the writer of the piece, with Kenneth Folk, maybe it's not Daniel Ingram, maybe it's Jay Michelson who's at the table. But in any event, you are quoted as saying...
And Kenneth's partner was there as well.
Okay. And you are quoted.
And my wife was there. My wife was there also. Let's get all the characters out.
I think you're just stalling because you don't want to be reminded of this quote. But maybe I'm wrong. So the writer says that the Wired writer says that you at some point says, do you realize that everyone at this table is enlightened? Presumably with the exception of the writer himself. But what did you mean by that? I mean, this, in a way, I'm asking what you mean by enlightenment. But
well, unfortunately, that's changed since I made that.
You no longer feel you're enlightened?
Well, yes and no. So the context, I'm glad you asked this, because this is the first person that's asked about this since the article came out, and it was, in some ways, it was totally embarrassing to see that, because it sounded like I was like being all machismo and like, we're all enlightened, man. There could have been some aspect of that was happening, but from what I remember, the context was really more about talking about how Kenneth Folk's way of kind of teaching meditation in Silicon Valley was really geared toward this more pragmatic approach. And the pragmatism that Kenneth really is known for is this pragmatism of saying, like, hey, all these practices and the results that they were, kind of designed to give people, and that all these people have written texts about, and all these people have, claimed to experience over thousands of years, like they're real, and it's not hyper esoteric, and it's not mumbo jumbo. If you just understand enlightenment as like a very simple human process of development.
I see.
And so when we were talking about enlightenment, we were talking specifically about a moment, a shift or transition, a phase shift in a practitioner's life, wherein they go through a process of insight, and that culminates in a very particular kind of insight that we were talking about earlier, actually, when we were talking about awareness. It's this insight where everything kind of consciousness and all the objects of consciousness kind of vanish. And then there's this rebooting process. Traditionally, that was called the first stage or the first experience of enlightenment. And so, because I knew all of the people well at the table there, and almost all of them were teachers. My wife, Kenneth, his wife, Jay, all of us were teachers at the time. And I just sort of was saying, hey, like all of us have experienced this thing, at least as far as we can tell when we talk to each other and we compare notes. This thing is not common, but it doesn't take like a whole lifetime to achieve or experience, and it's not all that weird. It's just a normal human experience.
And it's not enlightenment in the most extreme sense of moral perfection,
right?
Ongoing nirvana, and so on.
Yeah. I wasn't trying to make a claim about being perfect, but that's the thing, is that enlightenment, in some ways, enlightenment, awakening, God, Buddha, like these are all concepts that we basically use to throw all of our ideals and attach them to, and then try to achieve. And so, Kenneth and that whole movement really was about kind of disabusing some of the ideals from the words and seeing what is actually achievable, and trying to empower people to achieve those things if they're interested in them. I've since kind of changed perspectives a little, but that's kind of where.
Well,
that's what I meant.
Is it easy to summarize how you've changed perspective?
Just okay. I guess I've seen that. Okay, so Nietzsche said God is dead. Okay, great. So we had all these ideals and all this sort of institutional rigidity tied up with this notion of God. In the Western world, you know this better than I do. And at a certain point, that the whole fundamental assumptions and philosophical narratives break down around that. And then suddenly it's like, okay, our God is dead. Like this idea is dead in terms of its power. Like that's both a really good thing, I think, in the same way that enlightenment can be like demythologized, but I think it also does something really damaging, which is that it keeps us from being able to imagine new ways to get enlightened. Or it keeps us from thinking that there's more.
You mean to have any one definition of enlightenment? Is that?
Yeah, I think any definition of enlightenment which you've achieved.
Right. To have an attainable conception of enlightenment.
Yeah, and so there's problems on both sides. If I have an unattainable conception and I can't see anyone else around me who's experienced it, which is my main critique of sort of early Buddhism's definition of enlightenment. And it was Kenneth's as well, and that's what we were trying to kind of fight against, then, it becomes this sort of weird thing where you're dedicated your life to trying to achieve this thing that no one else is achieving. And so it's like, wait, man, maybe you actually deluding yourself into thinking that is achievable. Whereas, but to have a goal or an aim or a direction to go in that is like inspiring and brings me out of what's known. Like, I think you could also say that that's one of the functions that enlightenment serves, or that these ideas serve. And I think it can be a mistake to just totally disabuse ourselves of the myths and then think that there is no mystery left, in these things. Okay. And that's where I see, like, that's just a kind of enlightenment. It's like it's a type of enlightenment. There are many other ways to wake up or see things.
Yeah. I'm not personally worried about getting to a point where there's no more progress to be made.
Yeah, you're already too far enlightened.
No, it's the opposite problem, I'm afraid.
So says the enlightened person.
Oh, good. Well, that's a relief. So tell us.
Enlightened. they claim that they're not. Right?
Yeah, so I'll keep claiming it. So tell us quickly where we can find your stuff. Now you've got so there's the Buddhist Geeks, there's the podcast, which I know is kind of being revamped and had been mainly you interviewing people. I think it's going to emerge as something with a bigger cast. And there's a Buddhist Geeks Twitter feed, right? This at Buddhist Geeks, or is it just your own personal Twitter feed? Yeah. Okay. So it's Buddhist Geeks. So where else? And then meditate.io, is that a URL? Or?
Yeah, that's the name of the project and also the URL. So it keeps things simple. Mm-hmm. That's the place where we're doing the sort of modular meditation training stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I encourage people to look you up.
Thank you,
Vincent, and maybe we'll talk again down the road.
All right. Awesome.
Okay. Take care.